Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over the Stockholm Regional Championship results, as well as the Puerto Rico special event results as well, where we have a number of deck lists. This is still in the Temporal Forces format, and there are still a couple more tournaments to go in this format before we start shifting our attention to Temporal Forces. Myself and Jack have already done a bunch of IRL gameplay videos, and we are going to be doing our set review towards the end of this week, so we're going to be having a bit of a split of our attention right now on the current standard format as well as the upcoming format. So just letting you know that I'm now back from Sweden. Obviously I was commentating this one, so I had to go out a little bit earlier. That's why there's not been much on the channel recently, but I am going to be ramping it up again this week. Let's jump into the day one analysis, and unsurprisingly Charizard was extremely popular. Then we have Lost Zone variants combined, followed by Chien-Pao EX. Even though it did really well in the previous tournament, it hasn't really grown too much in popularity. From Indianapolis, it stayed about the same in terms of popularity. Ancient Box is an interesting one, picking up in play, possibly just trying to feast on the amount of Chien-Pao. That's one of Chien-Pao's worst matchups out in the field, alongside possibly Blocklax, which is pretty interesting. We then have Lugia and Arctina in at 6 and 5%ers, and then jumping onto the best of the rest, we have Roaring Moon, we have Dialga, which obviously won the previous tournament, gaining a bit of popularity, but it's still not all that popular actually. Still, again, just that 1 week turnaround means there's not that much time for it to really ramp up and play too much, I don't think. Also, there's easy tweaks that other archetypes can do to have a bit of time into that Dialga as well, so might be one of these archetypes where if people are prepared for Dialga, it's going to be a less strong choice. As we know, its power level isn't like the absolute highest compared to all the other archetypes, so it could well be like a one and done kind of deck, although we did see some relatively high placing lists as well in Stockholm. Gardevoir in there, Snorlax at just at 2%, but let me tell you, the 15 players that chose to play Snorlax were all really, really strong pilots. A number of them were NA players travelling over to Sweden to try and jump up on their championship points and maybe earn some cash along the way as well. Also just trying to secure their stipends and travel awards and that sort of thing. So very high echelon of pilots choosing to go with Snorlax for this tournament. I think it's that classic case of Charizard has to worry about Dialga techs, Chien-Pao techs, Mirror techs so much at the moment that it doesn't necessarily get to play the double Churro Yelchir that we'd seen initially at the EUIC. So given enough weeks time to pass where lists are adapting so far away from that initial EUIC list, then opens the door for Snorlax to once again be a decent choice, which is always the thing you have to bear in mind, that a deck can just fall out of popularity for a certain reason, and it could then go full circle. I was actually mentioning this on my Spill the TCG podcast with a couple of my caster friends, Alex and Ben Rabioti. I actually said this like a week before the tournament that it was likely to happen, and then it did, which is kind of interesting. And a few other people had the same idea by the looks of things. Getting into the day two analysis, you can see just how good Control had it, with Pidgeot and Snorlax making the day two graphic and having very, very good conversion. That's like 50% conversion for Snorlax, even better conversion for Pidgeot / other control or whatever you'd call it, which is pretty impressive. Charizard, despite being the most popular, keeps and improves on its percentage, which is again just super impressive. Ancient Box also having a pretty good tournament overall, and those Lost Box variants kind of held strong, as did the Chien-Pao decks. So yeah, those seem to be the best archetypes in the room in Sweden. You're gonna have to forgive the voice. Yeah, I'm a little bit under the weather after the event because I was obviously talking so much that the voice is the first thing to go when you're a bit under the weather, especially traveling and that stuff. But looking at the top 8 decks, I mean, the players themselves absolutely stacked. Tord, Azul, and Brent all in one top 8 alone is insane. But then you have Hermione and Stian, who have had great seasons, and actually great couple seasons. Yuho Kalama, also one of the most busted seasons, and an IC winner this year. John Eng, who has been a consistent player for many, many months, but has recently moved on to Chien-Pao and is piloting it really well. And Ferris Sakum, for players in the UK for many years back now, will certainly know the Sakums as essentially folklore for the best players in the game back in the day. And Faraz has got a top 4 at the junior division, world championships, and also a number of top 16s in seniors. So seeing him get back into the game alongside his brother Sammy, who also has a storied career in the world championships in the masters division, awesome to see them making a comeback. And obviously they still have that high-level play when they once again turn their attention to the game, and Faraz is proving it here with a top 8 placement with Charizard EX. Going into the deck list themselves, Azul playing that Snorlax block deck. A couple interesting inclusions in the list. The Sandshrew in here with that sand screen saying that trainers in your opponent's discard pile can't be put into their deck by effects of opponent's items or supporter cards. This card is pretty helpful at denying Silene, certainly shows up in Chen Pao decks at the moment. We even saw it in some Goldengo decks on the stream. Going to be good against Team Yelchir if anyone still is playing that in Charizard, and is also pretty good against Palpad, which can also show up in the Charizard decks and a few other archetypes just generally, as well as being potentially a mirror tech as well, because you're denying your opponent Silene from reusing certain things as well. So yeah, a pretty versatile tech inclusion that seemed like a good call for the weekend. Beyond that tech choice, pretty interesting to see 2 copies of Mimikyu and Rotom V. Oftentimes you see 2 copies of Hisuian Heavy Ball, but I suppose just having additional copies of these Pokemon in the opening stages are overall more beneficial to you, because they're Pokemon you want to put in play to just establish your board regardless. So even though you kind of lose a space by doing it this way round, these are good early game Pokemon to see. Obviously your ideal lead is usually block Snorlax, but there will be situations where the safeguard is more helpful, and having a second copy of Mimikyu also helps out around Lost City as well, which could randomly be a tech card in a number of archetypes as well. And once again, the block Snorlax has to be a respected archetype. It's happened again. It looks like the tech inclusions now have to circumvent Sandshrew as well, so it may just be back to physical copies of Boss's Orders and physical copies of Churro coming back into deck lists to try and deal with this archetype. Once again, I think talking to a number of the players who chose to go with Snorlax was because this deck in particular has a much better time into Dialga V-Star and a better time into Chien-Pao as well, and both those matchups obviously did well in Indianapolis, so there's a reason to convert over to this build instead. Hermione played a really interesting Lost Zone box deck to second place, where you're replacing the typical Raikou V for a Rotom and Luminion V, both like consistency boosting cards for the most part, which is great to see. And in thanks to the Rotom and the extra copy of Lost Vacuum, we actually did see Hermione get to 7 in the Lost Zone quite frequently by turn 2, unlocking the best attackers in the deck. And we even saw against Tord some devastating use of Radiant Greninja, so definitely a matchup worth watching back and seeing how this list functions. It actually really reminds me of old builds of the Turbo engine in the Silver Tempest format, which was so focused on just getting to 7 as quickly as possible. One of the other really cool inclusions was Defiance Band. This is a really versatile option. It can help you out against Ancient Box. It can push Iron Hand into much better damage output, maybe even dealing with Pidgeot for 3 prizes on full hit points. It can even go on Radiant Greninja if you're going to bring up a certain Pokemon and Defiance Band up to 120 into the active. That can also be quite relevant. So there's a surprising amount of maths that can come into it with Defiance Band being so cheeky at times. And there is one copy of Town Store on the list as well to try and cherry pick it throughout the game. I've actually always been a fan of Town Store Pokestop over Artisan, which has been the wave for a long time. So I'm really happy to see this list have that breakout performance, because having that extra out to Forest Hill Stone and having a bit more dig in the deck with Pokestop definitely is welcomed in the list, compared to Artisan, where you're really just trying to reload like Cram and Sableye, but these aren't the big hitters of the deck anymore. You're really looking to weave in the multi-prize Pokemon instead at this stage. Then we come on to Tord's top 4 list. It's a combination of Pidgeot Control and Charizard Pidgeot, 2 really strong archetypes in this format, of course, and you're really trying to switch up your strategy based on the matchup by having Mimikyu, Chi-Yu, Luxray V, and Regieleki all as one-of copies in the deck list. You cover a wide array of matchups where you're trying to just play the disruptive side of things alongside your Hero's Cape Ace spec choice, and even the DTE can help out, obviously using Luxray, Pidgeot, and possibly even using your Radiant Zard a little bit earlier than expected. If you're not taking prizes in the Charizard mirror match and just using Hero's Cape and other hit point buffs and keeping the Zard at low damage output all game, you can really do some cool penny loop shenanigans with your various basic Pokemon, and there is the double Palpad, the double penny in here to try and make that happen. We've got the very cheeky Roseanne's backup. It can help reload some special energy. It can help reload TM Devo, Hero's Cape if your opponent's extended into a KO rather than used Lost Vacuum to deal with it. And at the same time, obviously recycling some of these Pokemon could be handy, and also allows you to sort of cut a corner and play one Super Rod. Thornton's also helping you cut down that Super Rod count as well. It does look very greedy to not be playing a Manaphy in the deck list, but you do play Hero's Cape and Bravery Charm, so against aggressive Greninja decks, you can just use Arven and try and hit point buff one of these Pokemon to try and protect them that little bit from a turn 2 Greninja. There's no doubt this is going to be a really difficult deck to pilot, and I haven't quite figured out which matchup is which in terms of whether you go down the Charizard route or the Pidgeot route, or if it's going to be a mixture of the two in most games, so I basically just need to play more with the archetype to give you concrete proof. But if you want to challenge yourself as a player, this is certainly a really interesting list to have, because you have so many options within the 60, and navigating those options throughout the game is going to be how to get the best results. And as we know, Tord is very good at navigating his decisions. We then come to John's Chen Pao list, unchanged from Orlando, where he got a top 32 placement and Reagan got that top 4. So once again, the list is doing really, really well. Not too much to add, really. Whenever we saw John on stream, he was playing the archetype very, very smoothly, and it seemed like all the counts make sense. So I think this is just the default list going ahead. Just like Hermione, Brent Tonneson was choosing to play a Town Store heavy list, utilizing that Forest Seal Stone. Getting just that guarantee of Chorus is such a big deal. And at the same time, if you don't require the Forest Seal Stone early, you can try and allow this to give you some late game checkmate scenarios by having Iron Hands or Roaring Moon powered up and having a Forest Seal Stone Raikou on the back. You can protect yourself from hand disrupting quite nicely. For the longest time, Lost Zone has played a ton of one-ofs, so it's pretty interesting to see the double count of Roxanne, the double count of Boss, and also the second copy of the Roaring Moon EX in the list as well. Oftentimes you'll see this be a Hooper EX or a Mew EX, but clearly Brent thought it was important enough to go for that additional copy. What's also, I think, really interesting is that you can bait your opponent by Lost Zoning one of your 2 Roaring Moon, and they think it's no longer possible for you to use this card because so often you see it just as a 1 count, that playing that second copy of Roaring Moon can catch people off guard when it actually comes into play. So Lost Zone was indeed 3 of the top 8 placements, but they're all quite different lists as we're coming to see here, because we have Steon 60, who has already had a really great placement, I believe is also a top 4, with a Radzard plus Roaring Moon deck, now playing Radzard plus Iron Hands EX in the list, alongside those 4 copies of Mirage Gate. There's also some pretty interesting tech basic Pokemon. We've got the Iron Bundle, the Spiritomb, which I'm sure got value this weekend with the amount of Snorlax and Pidgeot around, and playing the Cobalion, helping you push into that Ancient box a little bit more. Pretty cool to see the TM Crisis Punch coming in as well. Supplementing the double Cramorant certainly helps out into V-Star matchups. Steon's basically a master of the Radzard Lost Box at this point, so no surprise to see them doing well with it once again. Yuho Kalima's brave enough to keep playing the Future Box and is still getting great results with the archetype. The list is, as you'd expect really, very streamlined, very straightforward, high counts of the cards you need, and not much fluff in here whatsoever. It's a bit of a surprise to see just the 1 copy of Boss's Orders and no Pokegear within the 60. Oftentimes we've seen a flip-flop in that direction rather than having that high counter catcher count that initially came out in Japan alongside Gift Energies. It does make me a little bit nervous in late game situations when your opponent is hand disrupting, but at the very least you do still have that Mew EX to help out. And then we end on the Succumb 60, where Sammy got top 64 and Fares got top 8. Playing the double Charmeleon, otherwise very standard counts of your Pokemon. Has a double Churro scenario in here, and is choosing to play that maximum belt rather than Prime Catcher, I think in response to the amount of Chen Pao and also being a decent mirror card. And I think it makes a lot of sense right now to revert back to this A-Spec if we're still expecting a lot of POW in the future. Also see the 2 copies of Lost Vacuum, which I haven't seen in a number of deck lists right now. Surprised to see it over extra copy of Counter Catcher, honestly, when you're not playing Prime. But Lost Vacuum's certainly a handy card right now, so can't really argue about it. Couple interesting deck lists that didn't quite make top 8. We have Yella, who has been adapting their Goldengo list. We saw them on stream and they had a really unfortunate situation where they somehow just weren't drawing into Vessels or energy cards, even with Pokestop and basically lots of draw from their Goldengo and Greninja. Don't really know how that happened. But yeah, they had a really interesting list where they've added the Barrel engine into here to give you a bit more Iona protection, which I think is pretty reasonable overall. You can even just start your turn with incisors, because you'll usually use your superiors, grow a big hand size full of energy, start your turn, or like end your turn with a Make It Rain. Even if you're taking prizes, you can still end up on like 3 or 4 card hands. So even if you're not getting hand disrupted, you can begin your turn with the barrel before using your coin bonuses. And the other part that's interesting about the list is that it's 3 copies of the Cypher Maniac to combine with your coin bonus, your Greninja, your Big Barrel, and the 1 Pokestop. I would have thought there'd be a higher count of Pokestop to have even more synergy with this card, but I suppose with so many one-of lines of Pokemon, it may be a little bit risky at times. Also cool to see that Yella is playing the Silene. By having 1 Churro, 1 Palpad, 1 Switch, 1 Silene, 1 Prime Catcher, you did give yourself enough defense against the trapping strategies that are in the format, and I think not many opponents would expect just this many outs in the list, so having some respect for control certainly paid off for Yella at this tournament. And a quick shout out to Fabio, who reloaded the Dialga Metang from Indianapolis, the same 60 as Hedrick, and did end up with a top 32, so it's not just a one-hit wonder. We're also going to zoom through the Puerto Rico special event results. It was a 180-player tournament, so a little bit smaller. Jose Morero was playing the Goldengo deck and got the win, which is a real surprise. But quite similarly, played a list very similar to Yeller, but instead of playing the Bibarel, played a 1/1 Revev which I think is pretty interesting, gaining additional cards, of course, and having a higher weighting towards Irida rather than Cypher Maniac, and also a thicker Palkia line, but actually quite similar in the mentality by adding this extra 1/1 package that provides draw power, something that's pretty interesting, I think, that stood out here. Even more Lost Zone box, pick your poison. This is a second place 60. More similar counts to what we've seen in the past, honestly. No town store in this one, just having the one copy of Artisan to supplement with your ball search. There was also another top 4 for the Radzard build that also had Iron Hands and Mirage Gates. Again, I wasn't expecting to see this show up in 2 different places in the world in one weekend. It also played the Crisis Punch and also had the TM Devo. I would have thought by having all of these tools, you'd play at least one copy of the Town Store to help out, but maybe that's something that I'm just overthinking. And beyond that, it's pretty standard lists of Moon to Dunsparce. This one did actually fit in the Temple of Sinnoh. A couple Chien-Paos again, we've seen so many of these at this point, and a Giratina. I think it chose to play some interesting cards. I think it was the, chose to play Spiritomb in the list and double Sinnoh. So some interesting counts with these lists, but overall more of the same from the Temple Forces formats. So there it is, guys. Sorry it was a short one today, but my voice is still recovering, to be honest with you. So let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.